Hi there, and welcome to the Rethinking Human Factor podcast with me, Bruce Hallas. For this, the special Christmas edition. Now, for those of you who listened to the last podcast in the series, we made a promise at the end of that we'd be taking a slightly different approach to this particular chat. Now, normally what we do is we look outside of the security industry and we engage with people who we believe share sort of common challenges around awareness, behaviour and culture, and then who have either studied in that particular area or have addressed those particular challenges themselves. And in some cases, they've been doing that, and the lessons they've learned, they've brought that into the information security field. Now, what we wanted to do this time round was to ask one of our listeners to actually come on the show and to share with us the key lessons that they had learned from listening to, in this case, the first three podcasts. Now, just as a reminder who the first three podcasts were with, it was Gregory Michaelidis, who was the Director of Communication Strategy under the Obama administration at the Department of Homeland Security. We had Heather, Dahl and Chase, who basically set up the Ninja comic. And Heather originally came from a background in journalism, public policy, broadcasting, and then she sort of took those skills and moved into the area of education around cybersecurity, specifically for young children and teenagers. And then the third person we had was a gentleman called John Pollock. Now, John Pollock was the ex-speechwriter to the ex-US President Bill Clinton. So, he's got an interesting take on things. He's really, really very strong around analogy and storytelling. And he come from a journalism background again, moved into public policy. And then he was, helping leaders of public policy or any type of policy, how to actually communicate that effectively to audiences. So these three interviews were great. For me, when I remember looking at the notes, there was so much information that was learned. But a takeaway we got back from some of our listeners was there's so much information in these interviews that they really would like some sort of hash. And so we went out, we asked one of the listeners whether or not they would be prepared to spend some time, write some notes and come and have a chat with us on the show. And that's what today is all about. So without any further ado, our guest today is Geordie Stewart. I've known Geordie for some time. And Geordie actually, has acted as an interim CISO for the likes of House of Fraser, TUI UK in Europe, and he's now taking up a role at Nationwide Building Society. So let's get on with the show. Hi, Geordie. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for your time. So I think your name's quite well known, especially in the UK and probably more broadly across Europe. But for our colleagues further afield, and for those that haven't had the pleasure of seeing you sat on the panel, standing in front of a conference audience, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, brilliant. Thanks very much for inviting me on. It's a pleasure. So my background, I've been in information security for 20 odd years now. Previously, I've worked for marketing companies and I did a psychology course at university. So I've always been very much interested in the human factor side of security. And I took the opportunity when I was doing my master's degree at Royal Holloway to focus on what makes communication effective to end users. And I was quite interested at the time that our approach as an industry was very amateurish compared to other industries that have been doing this for a long time and take it very seriously. And it's been a particular interest of mine to promote techniques that I think could be of interest to security professionals in order to achieve a better influence for an audience.
Okay, so I think that's really interesting. With Holloway, you chose the psychology side of things. Is that something you think we as an industry need to get to grips more effectively with? How people are thinking things through when they're receiving information around information security?
Oh, absolutely. I think the challenge for us as security professionals is that we're not very good at understanding our audiences. People are very busy. They have tasks that they're trying to achieve during the day. People don't set out to be secure. They set out to be safe as they perform an action. And while we tend to think of security as an absolute, for most of our audience, it's a byproduct of doing something right. And in a busy environment with lots of competing messages, most of which we ignore, the challenge is how do we make sure messages of value land in a way that somebody can use a benefit from? And I think in particular we've struggled in the fact that because we don't understand our audiences very well, we don't understand how messages are going to land. Okay. So we invited you to, listen to the first 3 or 4 interviews that we did here on the Rethinking Human Factor podcast.
And what we asked you to do, we thought there was an opportunity there, because for every interview that we do with people from outside the security industry, we try and ensure that there's maybe 3, 4 or 5 key points for our listeners to take away and to do some research behind. And the reason why we invited you onto the show, other than your knowledge in this particular area, was to say, what have you learned from those interviews? Now, for me, I remember I wrote the notes out afterwards, and there was so much that I've taken away from that. But I think what we were really looking for from today was to say, okay, having listened to it, what are the key messages that you've taken away? Because I think having an information security background yourself and having that background in the human factor and the psychology bit, I think you're probably going to pick out some really interesting points for people to take away. So what do you think is the first thing that you took away from any of those interviews that you've listened to on the podcast?
Well, firstly, this is an amazing, fantastic series of podcasts that it's been brilliant of you. I don't know how you managed to get so many amazing people on your podcast. For me in particular, even knowing this area quite well, I'm amazed at how many concepts are new that I haven't heard of before. And I think in particular that having these discussions with people outside of the security domain is absolutely essential if we're going to move forward, because we're largely doing the same things that we've done for 30 years now, which is, we have security induction sessions and a series of PowerPoint slides, and we tell people how to create a password. But the evidence of how these activities are moving us forward is very, very poor. In fact, there's lots of evidence that we're not moving anywhere. So if we think of the LinkedIn password breach, for example, what we saw was an appalling range of passwords that people had chosen, but yet we have given password instructions to millions of people over and over again for 2 or 3 decades now. So the evidence of what we're doing with our current way of working within the security and IT domains is very poor. So look, I think it's fantastic that we're having all these conversations with people outside of the security industry.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad that you found it of some value. But coming back to the key points, I mean, one of the things I picked up at the beginning of the conversation we had is that the whole point about how well we as the security professionals understand the audience and the impact of that in terms of how we go about developing and deploying awareness campaigns. Now, that was something you mentioned right at the beginning, wasn't it?
Yep.
So what's your view on that, and maybe some of the challenges we face and some of the challenges that you face and how you've maybe been able to overcome them?
Well, I think perhaps part of this conversation is about recognizing that the way we define our problem and therefore the way that we try and solve it is actually part of the problem now. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fantastic. I think that this podcast is helping to break the mold of, well, actually, what is security awareness? What is a behavioral intervention? Because I think, unfortunately, we're in a bit of a rut where security awareness is about content that you push to an end user, and once you've pushed it, it's job done. And I think now, increasingly, thinking about some of the conversations across the earlier podcast, that there's especially a common theme that compliance or behaviour in general is a choice. People have choices every day. People are given all sorts of instructions every day about what to buy, what to wear, what to think, who to vote for. And people make choices every day about which ones they're going to pay attention to and for how long. And as easy it is to rely on a captive audience and just issue instructions to people, those instructions are landing in a very busy atmosphere where there's lots of other instructions. Security aren't the only people issue instructions to end users within organizations as well. There's facilities, health and safety, finance, anti-money laundering. There's all sorts of other areas that are competing for attention. And attention is very much a finite resource. Mm. So if we just rely on having a captive audience, in no way are we getting the best value from our messages. And I think particularly in some of the earlier podcasts, we talked about, well, how might we make messages, firstly, attractive to be consumed, that somebody would actually want voluntarily to consume it and be interested in more. And then secondly, how do we make sure that there's a frame of reference so that they're processing that information correctly?
No, it's interesting because I think in one of the interviews, I think it was with John Pollock, one of the things he pointed out, he used the word engaging, and that's something I think we use across the industry. We're looking to create more engaging content or more engaging experiences. And that seems to be a little bit of a mantra that we have within the industry. But the point that John Pollock makes, and this is based on his experience of helping President Bill Clinton with, speech writing, that type of thing, was it's not that difficult actually to get engagement with people. And you can do it you can be really, really shocking. So I saw an example recently of somebody was talking about something within the security industry, and they really use a really, really strong headline, the type of headline that you either love it or you hated it, okay? But it engaged with them. But John's point was the engagement piece isn't where the work stops. Actually, the hard bit is in how do you maintain the levels of engagement you've reached out to the audience in the first place. And I think that's quite an interesting piece. If you can get that attention just for a while amongst all those other messages that you mentioned, what's the plan for maintaining that? Is this something that's going to happen once in a year, or is this something that you want to be drip feeding over a period of time? And so, what's your feeling on that sort of engagement and then maintaining that level of engagement?
Absolutely. So I really liked John's analogy that he did, where he talked about communication as a meal, and he talked about how do you make sure it's presented well, that it tastes good, and that people are going to eat the whole thing and consume the meat, whatever the point of it was. And I think one thing that we need to recognize here is that people are quite good at filtering, and they learn what they can safely filter. And people do this every day. So effectively, they decide what stimuli they can ignore, and it's not going to have any consequence for them. So I think very much the challenge is how do we make communications easy to understand and have an obvious benefit? And I think if either of those two principles are missing, then people's attention span are going to drop quite rapidly.
Right. And going back to what you were just saying there was the sense of there are all these messages, and people filter out those messages according to what's going to have. What was the phrase you were talking about? What's going to have an impact? What's going to have a repercussion if they don't pay attention to it?
So in psychology, it's called habituation. And you can see it at zoos, for example, where a gorilla's behind a pane of glass, and kids can come up and tap on the glass, and the gorilla completely ignores it because they know it's got nothing to do with either danger or food, and they just ignore it.
Yeah.
And I suspect sometimes our security communications are a bit like that.
That's a great way of illustrating it. Yeah, it's something like the gorilla has, in terms of the audience, there is no repercussion. It doesn't on a very basic level. It means nothing to them, which I guess brings us to the challenge of how do we reach out to people? How do we give them something which makes them turn and look at the child and pay attention to the message?
Yep. Well, interestingly, there's another theory around why people choose to accept avoidable risk. And it's called learned helplessness, and it's based on a series of experiments that were done some time ago now with dogs, where dogs were held in a pen and electric shocks were delivered into the floor. And of course, the dogs, if given a chance to escape, would escape this pen, they'd jump over. But what they found, though, is that if the dogs were prevented from escaping the pen and subjected to shocks, the dogs would just accept the shocks. If then they were given a chance to escape the pen and then shocks were administered, that the dogs would just stay and accept the shocks. And the theory is that once people get used to an impact, that they will actually just tolerate it to far higher levels than they used to. And what I'm curious about is whether complexity becomes a barrier for people to escape their shocks. So if, for example, we think about how for the average person, security can be a very complex subject matter, is there a chance that actually people will just internalize a risk and say, it's too complex for me to understand, it's going to happen to me no matter what I do, so I'm just going to accept it?
Okay. So the risk is that, but if people already have that perception that it's too complicated, and you then create campaigns which seem to communicate it's complicated, that you're basically reinforcing something which is subconsciously within them anyway, that then when they do receive something, even if you get them to participate in the awareness raising activity or educational activity, whatever it is, that in effect they turn up like the gorilla behind the glass, okay? They turn up, but they're not really there. And it's a case of signed in, etc. Yeah,
exactly. But I think people are good at also evaluating their prospects of successfully performing a risk management activity. And that's part of their thinking about whether they decide to take action or not. And I think there is a risk with some of our security communications that we're overcomplicating matters. So we, on the security side, often set out with an expectation that we're going to train people. We're going to help them understand how a system works in order so that they can, be part of its operation correctly. But there's a counter school to that, of thought to that, which is actually people don't need to understand all the detail, but they just need to understand some rules of thumb. And we've seen how this works in other industries. So, for example, in the medical industry, in hospitals, at various points in time, it used to be really complicated to work out whether somebody was at risk or having a heart attack. And somebody did some work about 2 decades ago, and they actually figured out that really it boils down to 3 rules of thumb. And so they scrapped all that complexity and they just focused on those 3 rules because it was something they could operate quickly and reliably and usually get to the right result.
Right. Okay. So basically simplify it, get some rules of thumb, and let's sort of build awareness around those rules of thumb. And the thing I like about the idea of rules of thumb as well is that things change, and that you can define expectations of individuals within an organisation. But what happens if the threat landscape changes in some way, or something happens in a different way? You almost need to push a degree of responsibility back to the audience. Not to just know these are the clear expectations we have of you in an organisation, but to know some of the basic principles so that when something falls outside of any of those scenarios, that they can apply some principles. And that's something that Gregory pointed out in the first interview. He had this towards the end. He talked about how there was almost a transfer of responsibility to the vendors of the need to take security seriously. It was almost a sense of, that's what the technology is there to do, so that I don't need to think necessarily about confidentiality or integrity, availability, or about an email and links within it, that type of thing. And I think it was an interesting point for him because he generally felt that there was this sort of, security isn't what I do, it's what somebody else does. What we're trying to say there is, you need to let them know exactly what's required of them, but you need to also make them aware that there are general principles that underlie pretty much all of security. And if you're aware of those, then you're likely to pick up the things which don't fall within the specific scenarios that we've possibly trained you on. So, impact of language, the role of language in terms of communication. This is something that I'm quite passionate about. But what's your view on the type of language that we use as part of our awareness efforts?
So I think there are some areas where our use of language has resonated and done very, very well. So, for example, virus as a metaphor is something that has been very, very successful. I think there's been other areas that we've been a lot less successful. And I think this comes back to, again, understanding our audiences. Because I think a lot of the words that we use in every day as security professionals, our audiences understand differently to us.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. We all have a set of lens, whether it's on your eyes or on your ears, and that means we interpret things differently. Different words mean different things to different people, different industry sectors, different professions, those type of things. So basically what you're saying there, we need to sort of have empathy with the audience that we're trying to communicate with the objective of trying to reinforce good behaviours or to influence behaviours so that they result in better positive security outcomes.
And I think one way of doing that, which I've seen work very well, and again, it's standard practice outside of information security, is to use personas. So in other words, you look at what sort of demographics you have in your audience, and you create a persona to represent each one of those demographics.
Right.
When you're designing your interventions, you think about, well, how is that particular strategy going to impact that demographic?
Yeah.
And when you define that demographic, you also include things like preferred learning styles, IT experience, length of service, any other cultural factors that you might think are relevant to how they might process an instruction to do with risk for an organization. And you need to ask yourself, using those personas, how is this communication going to land? Is it going to land in a way that they're going to understand? And is it going to land in a way that's actually going to be a practical difference for them?
So in effect, it's market research, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. And again, if you think, for example, in other areas, Apple and Coke and Gillette, they spend a fortune on market research. They know what their customers think. They know which value propositions their customers are going to respond to. They know their customers really well through demographics and focus groups. And I think, unfortunately, there's no escaping the fact that if we want to have the same comparable level of behavioural influence as these other players, we're going to have to copy their methods. There's no getting away from it.
And I guess, going back to comments you were making earlier, really, that, the question about whether or not we do or we don't want to have that sort of ability to influence people, at the end of the day, is it a question at all? The environment that people work within is so busy with information that there is a risk, and I think anecdotally most people would agree it's happening, that the information security message, whichever way you decide to deliver it, just doesn't stick out.
I think also that there's another factor here which we rely almost exclusively on fear, or either of a negative consequence or a punishment. And there is quite a bit of research that's actually being done to suggest that people don't necessarily respond as well to fear as they would to an incentive. So the extended parallel processing model is a theory put forward from the psychology field a couple of decades ago now, which says that actually, when threatened with a negative outcome, people will often choose to respond in a way that controls their fear rather than a way that controls their risk. And that's partly tied up on how complex do they think it is to actually go and do something about that. But in terms of how somebody might control their fear, they will do things like, this is going to happen to me anyway. It happens to everybody. I'm a lucky person. I'll be okay. There's always different ways that people rationalize that.
Yeah.
And we see that in society. That's why doctors and nurses smoke and continue to smoke.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Very true. And it's interesting because I've been really, really very fortunate this year to share the stage with Akuma Home, who we've done an interview with last month. So he comes from a psychology background, and with Jessica Barker as well. We've been doing a workshop around these type of issues, and the whole point about fear is something that Jess would have highlighted, and Kieran was, covering the topics of how people rationalise, the decisions that they make and the relationship with fear. So, absolutely spot on to make that point as well. Going back to the issue of language, though, there's obviously language in almost like the tone that we're using within the language and the use of jargon, for example. But what's your view on language in terms of the spoken word, the choice of the language? Corporation A, their language, the preferred language of use for the business is English, but maybe they've got operations around North America, Europe, South America, and the Far East. What do you see as being, do you see that as a challenge? Do you see the use of just one language as being a challenge when it comes to awareness campaigns on a global scale?
I think it is a challenge, absolutely. I think it's a challenge for a number of different reasons, though. I think partly it's a challenge because you need to think about how different words are going to land and be understood, especially where English might not be a first language. So in that sense, you're looking at the pure meaning of the words and how they're going to be interpreted. But at another level, I think there's something around making content interesting. And I think that's probably harder to do across language and cultural barriers. So if you think of how a company like Netflix might approach designing a new TV program, it's actually quite difficult to come up with a concept that captures people's interest and works really well, across boundaries. The sad result is that, most TV programs are probably moderately successful within one cultural group and largely are ignored across the rest of the world. So in that sense, you might say that they're not fantastically successful. And then you get other breakaway shows that, for whatever reason, just gel really well across cultures. But they're not easy to produce because in terms of content, things like humour can be difficult to stretch across cultural lines. What they might find funny in the States would be different to what we might find funny in the UK, which is different to what we might find funny in France.
Do you think that we as an industry are cognizant of this? Because, over the years I've been involved with a fair few campaigns within a global context, and I'm not sure that I've heard the conversation. I'm not sure that I've heard people sit back and go, there is a risk that if we don't incorporate an understanding of that cultural context, that local cultural context, as part of the development process to come up with the campaign, creative, the content that supports the creative, the design that supports the creative. I haven't heard that very often. And I just wonder whether or not you think maybe as an industry we're just not cognizant of the fact of the role that culture plays in terms of even the development side of it, and that maybe the tendency is to think that culture is about, we've designed it here in London, for example, and we're going to send it out to regional representatives and they will review the work that's been done. So they're not involved in the development stage or involved more in the Q&A stage.
Absolutely, I'd agree. I'd even go a step beyond that and say that many organisations don't understand all the subcultures that they would have. So cultures aren't just grouped around ethnicity, they're also grouped around other factors like people that work in engineering, people that have been with the company since the start, people that all work together in a certain office. And I think you not only need to understand the impact of culture, but you need to understand, the different levels of culture that you've got in an organisation and cumulatively what the effect of that is.
Yeah, it's a bit like when I was doing my research into these type of fields, there was I can't remember the quote exactly, but there was one of the authors was pointing out that the value in understanding these things is that it helps you understand how it can either potentially have an impact upon the likelihood of you achieving your objectives, or how it might be something that you can leverage to strengthen the work that you're doing as well. And it's you can't really manage what you don't know.
Absolutely.
And so if you're going to develop a good, effective awareness campaign, and if you generally want to bring around to leverage culture or to influence culture within an organisation, you've got to understand all those subcultures as well as the broader, national ethnic type of cultures. And you've got to take that into consideration. But how would you respond? Many people turn around and go, yeah, but the cost of doing that is really, really, well, a lot of people say it's really high. I often ask the question, so you've put a business plan together for doing this then? Because when I ask that question, most people turn around and go, no, I haven't got a plan for it. So it's an assumption. It's an assumption that it's going to be a really big exercise. People haven't actually gone away and had a look at what that actually would entail in terms of understanding culture.
Well, I think there's a really important differential to make here, which is that when we're standing at the bus stop and we look at a poster advertising a new film, the company that put that poster up isn't paying for our time. Organisations that put together a security awareness training program and lock everybody in a room for an hour, they're paying for that time. So if somebody said to me, I'm going to lock all of my employees in a room for an hour, of I don't know how many man years worth of time collectively, and they said, we don't really have time to do it properly and plan and think about how the message is going to land and understand the audience and the demographics, I personally would say that's a very expensive campaign.
Yeah.
Because we need to think about people's time, So for big companies like General Electric, taking up an hour or two of everybody's time, say, once a quarter, that's a huge cost. We shouldn't underestimate that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And then that's one of the challenges that people come across, the sense of how much time they can actually get with these audiences. And that's not actually that's a challenge in itself, but it's about how do you maximize it. If you're going to take a less mature approach to developing your awareness campaign or your education campaign, how you're going to influence behaviour, etc., then you're going to get poorer results.
Absolutely, because we are competing with HR and finance and all these other sources of information and guidance within companies. And there's another reflection on us too, which is if we're not capable of putting together something more interesting than the people in finance, then that probably doesn't reflect well on us.
No, there is that, but which is interesting actually, because it maybe brings us to another point, which has come up in the opening interviews that we've done with our guests here on the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast. The skills page, the skills debate. We were really lucky last week. We shared a panel together. We shared the stage. We did a panel at the ISC Squared Secure Summit in London. It was really well attended. And, the question of skills come up. And often, when we talk about skills within the industry, do you think, as part of that debate, we're thinking about, do we have the skills to actually, tackle the awareness, behaviour, culture challenge? Do you think that's in the debate at all?
Unfortunately, I think it still is a debate. I think too often security awareness is seen as an IT thing. I think probably the best thing we could do is just start again with people from outside of IT, people with genuine communications backgrounds and human behaviour backgrounds. I think there's always going to be a role for IT trainers, but I think the idea that we can train our way out of a behaviour problem is definitely holding us back.
Yeah.
Expertise from someone in IT is not going to solve this problem.
Which is really interesting, because that ties back to the comment that Heather Dahl made in her conversation, where they produce a comic, and she put her hands up and said, "We can do this. This is an absolute team effort." So there are those people that know the subject matter in real detail, but then you need to bring that to life in words that the audience is going to engage with and be able to understand. And then it's like, and then we need to also bring it to life through the design, the illustration, the side of the comic. That's a different set of skills altogether. And then she's like, okay, well, now we've got that. Well, actually, we've got to get this comic out to the audience itself. It's just because it's written, it doesn't mean that it's in it with the audience. So how do we logistically get it out there? And when she started painting the picture, you're like, yeah, it's not a one-person job, is it really? And you need to be bringing all those skills in, which sort of brings me to a question for you. There was a piece of work. I've got a lot of time for the SANS Institute, and they were talking about the average number of people involved in education and awareness within an organisation, and it said 1.5. Now, do you think that's 1.5 in terms of coordinating all these expertise, or do you think that's 1.5 people in terms of actually doing the creating of the content, creating of the campaigns, that type of thing?
So I suspect that 1.5 number is probably a composite of somebody who does IT training and induction sessions, as well as maintain newsletters and different sets of content for audiences. I think that's a long way away from an integrated marketing campaign designed to influence behaviour. And the reason why that is because actually the set of skills that you need in order to manage behaviour in a modern organisation is quite a number of different disciplines. And the idea that, one or 1.5 people could cover all that, even if they, had a communications background, it'd be like saying, let's give the Coca-Cola marketing strategy to one person, and we expect him to do all the kind of the mathematics crunching of all the demographics, all the advertising spend, design all the copy. These are all specialist roles from specialists who do this and have done it for years. And the idea that you could just squeeze it into one person and expect a good result just isn't realistic, is my view.
Yeah. Again, in my experience, when I think about the success successful work has involved quite a broad range of individuals. And actually what you really do need within an organisation is somebody that it's almost like a project manager or a coordinator who can keep all those experts going in the right direction. But it's an interesting point that what is the direction? What's the end goal? With the point you made earlier in terms of understanding, reassessing as an industry what it is that we actually mean by awareness or behaviour or culture, which is something that I share that belief with you that, people talk about it, but they haven't got a clear definition of what they actually mean by it. And more importantly, their organisation hasn't approved what they mean by awareness, behaviour or culture. So that's a discussion that needs to go on within the industry, rethinking.
Absolutely, because security awareness itself and the idea of raising security awareness, I'm not sure it's a very good metaphor, because there's lots of risks that people are well aware of, but it doesn't change behaviour. So, it doesn't feel like it's giving us the result that we wanted. So again, I go back to my example of, you drive past a hospital and there'll be a line of doctors and nurses smoking outside, and they're completely aware of the risk. The idea that we could raise their awareness any further is ludicrous.
Yeah.
But yet that's the metaphor we use. And then conversely, anything that can go up must come down. So, we always talk about raising awareness. Well, what lowers awareness?
Yes.
What communications do we have that actually impede people's ability to behave securely? Various rumours or mistaken ideas that we communicate.
Yeah. Well, I think an interesting point there, and the whole thing about what makes awareness drop away, in effect, rather than increase. The questions about, and this is alluded to in a couple of the interviews that we've done with our guests, the influence of the brand. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you can put a campaign out there to raise awareness about content, but if the audience's perception of information security is, is in the sense that the brand is not a strong brand, or it might even be a negative brand, or in the industry they might call it like a toxic brand. How does that, just by not understanding that, how does that undermine the effectiveness of your campaign? You've done all that hard work, you've got it out to the audience, but the audience, it's sort of falling on deaf ears because there's a problem with the brand already. Do you have a view on the whole challenge of the security brand and its role in terms of the effectiveness of a campaign and maybe pushing down awareness if it's negative?
Absolutely. So all communications start with a point of reference. And the point of reference is normally expressed by the words or phrases or analogies that you use. And I think, unfortunately, we've got to the stage where the moment you mention security awareness, people already have a pretty good idea of unfortunately, a set of negative outcomes of potentially mandatory content. It's not very interesting. They've seen it many times before. So particularly my exposure to government programs where they're mandatory and you have to recertify on a regular basis. There are people within government circles that look at the same content, dozens and dozens of times over the course of a number of years. And again, if we think of the gorilla behind the glass, how is that moving them forward? Potentially it's damaging the security brand more than it is helping them. Because again, the moment you mention that point of reference, security awareness, they've probably got a pretty good idea what they're in for. And unfortunately, that also applies to the budget holders. So if organisations are trying to do something a bit more innovative, they'll often find that when they approach the budget holder and they pitch something, which isn't a traditional death by PowerPoint or CBT, mandatory training program, it's a lot more difficult to get the funding approved from, some of the interactions I've seen. And that's a shame that we've somehow got locked into the idea of what security awareness is.
That's interesting. Yeah, the whole framing. And that framing goes on not just in the sense of, within an organisation. It's the conversations that go on across organisations between stakeholders, for example, who might be the people that you go to for the budget. So like CFOs that might be talking to other CFOs. And if there's a reinforcing on a social, cultural level there amongst finance officers, when they do get together, this is their experience of education awareness. And it's similar to what they're hearing from other organisations. Then I think that's sort of that frames their mind. That's what they think, well, that's what everybody else does, and there's a degree of comfort for all that. And for those of us who sort of come from understanding that the cognitive bias and heuristic side of things, that's a real problem. Because how do you push against that? How do you get new ideas through? And I know with Heather and with Gregory, they were quite hot on the topic of the lack of innovation when it comes to awareness efforts, which are designed to influence behaviour. Okay, so I've got a question for you. Do you think the fact that we have a captive audience, so to speak, within an organisation, do you think that by saying, well, okay, this is our market, our audience, do you think that has an impact upon how quickly or not we have evolved as an industry in terms of how we address the challenges of awareness, behaviour and culture?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think because we never really had the challenge of making sure that our content was interesting or useful, we've been able to just rely on the fact that security policies and training were mandatory. And, you know, that lack of drive for innovation and evolution means that, you know, I think many of our training programs, our security awareness programs, are where they were 20 or 30 years ago, that they haven't changed. It's still, you know, a 1 hour induction when you join the company, followed by a number of emails or interventions. But, you know, we haven't really moved anywhere. Whereas conversely, if you look at how, say, direct marketing works, they're constantly competing to make sure that they're effective as and efficient as they can be. And they've got that feedback cycle in terms of, you know, who's clicking on their links and who's buying their products. And while it's more difficult for a security awareness program to have an accurate feedback cycle, it's not impossible. And the reason why I say difficult is because you can either measure two things. You can either measure behaviours, in which case that can be tricky because if people know you're measuring their behaviour will change. Mm-hmm. So you're not measuring a real behaviour.
Yeah.
Or you're asking people to give you their opinion, and then you're subject to a number of biases. So, you know, the range of people that were subject to your intervention is usually different to the range of people who you managed to get a response to, and then their response will be filtered often in terms of what you wanted to hear.
Yeah.
And particularly if you look at some of the ways that we design our training and awareness feedback forms, they're really just designed so that people can say, yeah, it was fantastic, really enjoyed it, you know, well done, guys. But there's not really any expectation that behaviours are going to change.
That's a really interesting point. I think, you know, that one, the feedback loop, you know, for me, when I think about awareness, we have a predisposition in the industry generally, I think, to see awareness as pushing a message out. But what anybody would tell you, effective communication is about as probably listening more than doing talking.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that need for a feedback loop is something that is often, I think, an afterthought and not really recognised as being a really core part of any strategy to influence, you know, to raise awareness, influence behaviour and foster culture. You've got to have it. And the point you're alluding to is, okay, so if we're going to when we get this information, how do we design the channel to allow people to feed back to us in a way to minimise those lenses, the cognitive biases, the heuristics, etc., even the design of the form just generally and the language that you use to ensure we get the best possible feedback. But what do we mean by best? Well, basically, we want the best in terms of the integrity of the data. We want to use it to make better decisions about what we do. So we're relying upon the quality of the data, which is a real marketing challenge, isn't it? Really, at the end of the day, that was one of the things that marketers struggle with continually, is the fact that how good is this data to enable us to make decisions?
Absolutely. So one way that you can manage that is that you can ask people about their attitudes rather than behaviours, because as soon as you mention behaviours, you get subject to a range of biases. So, for example, if you ask people about, you know, are they going to go to the gym in the next week, you know, 99% of people are going to tell you yes, even though the vast majority of them won't be going to the gym next week.
Yeah.
So if you ask people about attitudes, I think you're far more likely to get an honest answer. And then especially if you can ask in a way that's morally neutral. In other words, you're not signaling a expected answer. So an example, I did this for a large organisation in the UK a while back to understand attitudes amongst the user population before we did an awareness program. Mm-hmm. And I found out that more than 60% of users in this organisation didn't feel comfortable reporting a co-worker for suspected misuse of computers.
Right.
So, I mean, this is an example about which once you know that information, you know, your opportunities to do something about it are there. You know, you're in a position of power now where you can do something about it, because unless you know that's a particular problem, you know, you can tell people what the process is to report suspected misuse, you know, every day. You know, you could tattoo it on people, but if fundamentally people, you know, view that activity as a form of snitching, then you're really not going to get anywhere. You need to tackle that cultural problem head on.
Yeah, really, really good point. For me, that's one of the things around the work I've been doing over the last couple of years is actually understanding the root cause behind these things. You know, the assumptions that we make if we provide a channel for people to be able to report behaviours which are out of sync with the organisation's expectations. That is on the assumption that people are going to be happy doing that. And you need to understand that actually that process might fail because of the type of things that you've just highlighted there. You know, attitudes people have, values that people have, and that's where, you know, coming back to that almost that cultural analysis, that getting the picture of the different cultures and groups, attitudes and values are associated with assumptions that people make. These are the things that underline the decisions that people are making, whether or not to comply with the policy and process that you've put in place. And in your case, what you've recognised that, and you look at an alternative way of getting people to come forward.
Absolutely, because when people don't respond the way that we expect them to, it's easy to sit back from our ivory tower in the head office and criticise people as irrational. But I think we need to be really careful about that, because I suspect that in most cases, if not all, what that actually is a disconnect between how we perceive a set of choices and how that particular user within the organisation sees the world.
Yeah.
So, for example, we might think it as completely rational to always install all your security patches, and therefore it's irrational to hold back on them. But actually, it's not hard to think of scenarios by which actually holding back on security patches might be rational for some people at some points in time.
Yeah.
So I remember speaking to somebody a while ago now who said that they were nervous about installing security patches because last time they did it, their machine was out of action for about a week and it had to be repaired and rebuilt.
Yeah.
So actually, for them, not installing security patches could easily be perceived as a rational choice.
In a way, what we're talking about here is the design of choices, designing outcomes, you know, behaviours through, you know, looking at, you know, your policies, process and procedures. So you might design it with a view to what is logical within your own mind as a security professional, but you're designing something really which is going to be consumed and used day in, day out by everybody else in the organisation who isn't a security professional. And so if you don't design it from their perspective, you may end up designing something that they never engage with, or they engage with, and the experience of engaging with it is something that means that they don't want to come back and engage with it again.
Absolutely. So to use that example of patching, you know, how that decision is framed for that person, the outcome of that was they decided not to install those patches. But if you take the time to understand their way of thinking and how they perceive the world, actually designing a slightly different choice, you know, is definitely possible. You know, so thinking about a patching dialog box, you know, if there was a reference on that dialog box to backing up documents before the patches were installed or saving the machine state, you know, that goes away towards understanding or influencing how that choice is made by that person.
And it's really, really important, this, because, you know, when we speak to people, why do you put an awareness campaign together? And then it's like, it's about influencing behaviours or reinforcing behaviours, which is something that I hear less of. But it's generally about, we're trying to influence behaviours. There's this sense that the only way to influence behaviours is through an awareness campaign. And actually, you can influence behaviour just through designing the security product more effectively.
Absolutely.
Before we even start creating awareness campaigns, it's like, let's get the basics in terms of, if the concept I've often used is, if security was a product, would you buy it? And if you bought it, would you buy it again? This sense of, let's design security. Part of the awareness behavior culture piece is about the way you design security in the first place.
Absolutely. And this comes back to the debate about rational users, because if users were irrational and therefore unpredictable, we couldn't design systems of choice. It's the fact that they are rational, or at least attempt to be rational, that we've got these opportunities to design these choice systems.
Yeah. And I think, we've got Dan Arley on in a couple of months, who wrote the book Predictably Irrational. So he's a behavioural economist. I'm sure you've heard of Dan. And I think he'd sort of back that up there, the sense of, there is a degree of irrationality and there is a degree of rationality. And actually, how you present something and create an environment could potentially increase the likelihood of people being more rational than irrational. But when you get it sort of wrong, and you don't create a generally great sort of environment for people to make choices within, then they're probably going to slip more into the predictably irrational side of things as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So particularly of interest is, how much time do we spend trying to be rational? And by that I mean, just because we make less than a perfect decision doesn't mean that we're not rational, or at least trying to be rational.
Yeah.
And if you think of most users within complex organizations, they're busy, they've got work to do. They don't have an infinite amount of time to spend on a task to make sure they achieve the best possible outcome for that particular choice. So I bought a SSD drive online the other day, and I spent about 15 minutes researching which one to buy. And no doubt, because I only spent 15 minutes searching, my choice was less than perfect. In other words, somewhere out there was a better drive at lower cost. But there becomes a part of which actually it is good enough. It's about satisficing. And I think we also need to understand that from a user's point of view, which is, users don't have infinite amount of time to reach the perfect decision across every task they're doing. Otherwise, they wouldn't get through their workload. And just because they approach the world from that point of view doesn't mean they're not rational, because they're still trying to be rational. They're just dealing with a finite set of resources.
Yeah. And it's that finite set of resources that means that we often rely upon shortcuts.
Absolutely. And then inevitably we have that conversation about how do we make being secure the easy, quick choice.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I guess a final point, really, as a bit of a wrap up, is the question of why, considering the importance, the critical nature of people in the whole security scenario, and with my work at the Analogies Project, one of the things we often talk about is like the hidden security story, which has continued throughout the whole course of humanity. Before we had servers and laptops and smartphones and all that, we still had information, and we stored it on other systems. The one consistent throughout the whole of this has been people, rather than necessarily the specific nature of the actual information systems or the type of information. So considering how people have been the one consistent factor in information security, cybersecurity, whichever way you're going to term this, why is it that the industry has only really just started seriously thinking about the human factor, in your view?
Maybe it's where the budgets have traditionally been held, where IT directors haven't necessarily wanted to spend a lot of money on an abstract concept which probably better sat within HR. I mean, traditionally, we've been trying to buy things to solve our problems. You could argue that it goes back to, our ability to risk manage in general, because I think as an industry, we're still relatively immature. So if you look at the insurance industry, for example, when there's a fire or a flood, they don't rip up the rule book and start again. They expect a certain number of events to happen over a time frame. Whereas in the security industry, it feels like when a negative event happens, especially if it's related to people, there's a certain amount of panic and ripping up strategies and starting again, as if we'd never expected things to go wrong. And it feels like as an industry, we're still relatively immature. Maturity should be coming to the point where an event happens and we say, we're already at an optimal control picture because we'd assume that event would happen every year or every 5 years or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be just ripping up our whole strategies for something that we knew was coming.
All right. Well, Geordie, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I think we covered a lot. I do know, having listened to the podcast interviews, there's probably even more to cover, but we've only got a certain amount of your time, and I'm incredibly grateful for the fact that you've agreed to share your thoughts on the podcast and the content and to apply some of your own experience to that. And I'm sure that all the listeners would have found it really, really useful. So thanks very much for your time, Geordie, in terms of joining us here on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Bruce. It's been an absolute pleasure. Keep up the good work.
We'll try our best.
Well, I hope you really enjoyed that. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to Geordie, and I'm really, really happy that he took the time to not just, he's obviously listening to the podcast, but he's clearly using it in the way we intended it, which was to sit down and to write some key notes. And then he's comparing that to his own experiences of developing education and awareness programs, being a CISO. But also, I think it's interesting that, his background when he went away and studied his master's degree, that he actually chose the psychology modules within the master's degree to follow. And that's something I really believe is going to be something we're going to see more of. And actually, at an event with the ISF, I was lucky to share the stage with Richard Corbridge. And Richard Corbridge was just about to take up a role as the CIO at the Department of Health in the Republic of Ireland. And in that, we were asked to sort of predict what the CISO of the future will look like. And one of the things that I felt would be a strong sort of direction for information security professionals in 2013 was a re-emphasis on actually developing skills in the area of the human factor, as we like to call it. So, yeah, it's great to see that Geordie was started on that journey many years ago. There are a lot of walkaway points for you. I hope you've been taking some notes there. A couple of top-level ones for me was really the point about, how well we understand our audience. If you're going to set out with the objective of raising awareness amongst a particular audience and influencing behaviour amongst a particular audience and sort of fostering a culture, you've really got to understand the audience. Not only have you got to understand the audience, but you've got to really see how you communicate with them from the audience's eyes. We've got to empathise. And I think there's been some blogs on the Marmalade Box site which talks about, the whole opportunity that comes from closer empathy with your audience. The second point that he raised was the question about why we're only having these conversations now about the human factor, and that maybe, we should have been having these conversations many years ago. And as part of that, I think the sense he gave was, awareness is just a push activity, and that there haven't really been many, feedback loops to, I believe, become more aware ourselves as information security professionals about the audiences and the things they're like and the things they're not. And this really comes down to the challenge of metrics. Now, metrics is a really, really hot topic whenever we do workshops throughout Europe and the Middle East and Africa at the moment. What we generally find is people say, well, give us some metrics. And that is a key challenge. And I think Geordie reflected upon that lack of feedback, that lack of metrics means that, really have things really, really moved on? Yes, we've got smarter with sort of more slick ways of presenting things, but really, what does it produce in terms of raising awareness, influencing behaviour, and fostering a culture? What are the metrics that back that up? And I think, there's questions about whether or not we're going about that the right way, or maybe we need to be thinking about opportunities for improvement there. The third point, which I think was really interesting, was the concept of captive audience. So, to a certain degree, we've got our employees, and that's our audience. It's set for us. And there's an expectation amongst those people that they're going to go through some form of training, not just on security, but on a number of different other areas. There's, like a captive market. And the point that Geordie really makes is that there are lots of examples where there are captive markets, not just around information security, where because it's a captive market and there is a lack of perceived competition, there isn't this sort of sense of trying to improve, trying to grab more. There hasn't been that. It's almost been like it's a tick box exercise. We do it for the market because they basically have to do it. They have to take part in the awareness campaign. They have to take part in the mandatory CBT, those sort of things. So I think it was an interesting point there, is the sense of if they didn't have to and we were competing for their attention like we were selling a product, and I think we alluded to that concept of, security as a product within the chat, that maybe we would be constantly looking to improve. And I think this is really important because the reality is that the people we're trying to communicate with day in, day out, to raise awareness and influence their behaviour and to embed things within the organisational culture, they're getting a lot of messages. And, a lot of these messages are coming through channels like email. So they're really there amongst a whole range of other messages. And the question is whether or not they're even engaging with it. And if they are engaging with it, is there an ongoing relationship to make sure that they're not just engaged with it, but they're remembering it and that they're likely to actually action something in line with the organisational expectations around security? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced. And I don't think Geordie was either. But it'd be interesting to hear what you've got to say. And then I think the final point, really, a big one for us, is the issue of brand and the role that brand plays in terms of how it influences what level of engagement you're going to get from people, whether or not people are going to choose to actually comply with organizational policies and procedures. Going back to the idea of security as a product, what is the brand? Who does it appeal to? What are the values, attitudes, etc., associated with the brand? Are they in line with the different cultures within your organization? I think Geordie made an interesting point where he talked about attitudes and understanding attitudes amongst the target audience, attitudes to the brand, but also to security and also to individuals. Core, really important thing. Again, we've blogged about this quite a bit, where you can have a great message, but if the personal brand of the communicator isn't in line with your overall function security brand, then the question there's a mismatch, and that might cause some challenges for you in terms of achieving your overall goal. So, the whole issue of personal brand is really important. And that's something actually that we're hoping to get somebody on the show who we've been introduced to following an event at ISC Squared. And somebody came from the audience and said, look, I know somebody that did the massive work around personal brand and the impact of branding within internal communications and culture. And so we're hoping to get them on the show to come and share some insights, and we'll keep you abreast of that. Anyway, I think it's a really important thing for the podcast to recognise. It's great to get the listeners on the show. If you'd like to come on the show, if you'd like to share what you've learned maybe over the previous 3 podcasts, please get in contact with the show. You can contact me at bruce.hallas@marmaladebox.com or get in contact with us via the Marmalade Box website. And we'll see what we can do in terms of scheduling you in to have a chat with us and to share your thoughts with the listeners. So, what's the next show? Well, if you want to know about when the next podcast is being published, then there are a couple of ways you can always stay in contact with us. The first way that you can do that is to go to the marmaladebox.com website and sign up to the monthly newsletter. Now, the newsletter is really a hash of everything that we have done and we have learned, and the articles that we found really interesting, which are associated with awareness, behaviour and culture. So just to be very clear, some of these articles actually might not be about security, but they will be about awareness, behaviour and culture. We're all facing this universal challenge, and there are lessons to be learned from outside the security industry. The newsletter includes a book review or a recommendation for a book to go into a reading list. It also includes a hash of the recent blogs that we've put together as a team. It also includes articles that we found interesting, written by other people. It will let you know what the recent podcast is and what the podcast that you can expect coming in the next month. And also, it's just a means of staying in contact with the team and learning things from us, hopefully. The other thing that the newsletter will do for you, it provides you with an opportunity to raise questions around awareness, behaviour and culture, and we then choose one of those questions and answer that on the podcast. We also answer a couple of questions in the newsletter as well. So, sign up, get those questions coming in. Maybe your question will get on the show. And if it doesn't get on the show, then maybe it's going to get in the newsletter. Other ways you can stay in contact with us, reach out to us on Twitter and to follow us up on Twitter, or to join the LinkedIn Marmalade Box user group. Or finally, just to ping me an email via the website, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you may have. So without further ado, this is the final episode in the series before Christmas. I hope that you have a great festive break and that you do get the opportunity to recover from the stresses and the strains and the real excitement that's going on at the moment within the security industry around security awareness, behaviour and culture. So take a break, but please do come back to the show, because even though we will be taking a break, I can assure you that awareness, behaviour and culture will not be overly far from my mind, even throughout the whole of the festive period. Thanks again for listening, and look forward to catching up with you next month and next year. Bye.